As Britain grapples with political upheaval, sky-high inflation and deep social issues, its once powerful global standing has faded into obscurity. In a dizzying carousel, the UK has seen 5 prime ministers in 13 years and 3 general elections in just 4 years. This has left the nation scratching its head, wondering who's really in charge, and asking, does it even matter anymore? A once sturdy economy now teeters on the brinks of collapse, and despite promises to get things under control, inflation has skyrocketed to levels not seen in over 40 years, soaring above a jaw-dropping 11% in October 2022. Unemployment rates are climbing, and just weeks ago, Birmingham, the UK's second-largest city, effectively declared itself bankrupt. Schools, hospitals, and public buildings are quite literally crumbling, with the irony of its parallels with the UK itself definitely not lost on people. It is clear the glory days of Britain's colonial past are over, but how did this once mighty empire fall so dramatically? Welcome to Living History. To better understand Britain's collapse, we need to briefly step back in time to the 18th century, when the British Empire found itself at the zenith of its remarkable expansion. Driven by boundless audacity and ambition, it extended its imperial influence to lay claim over immense territories, encompassing regions in Canada, Africa, and notably the jewel in its crown, India. The empire's ascent was nothing short of meteoric, and as the 19th century neared its conclusion, the British Empire stood as an unparalleled giant, extending its dominion across an astonishing 25% of the Earth's surface and governing a quarter of the global population. As the saying goes, the sun never set in the British Empire. The bustling streets of London became the epicenter of global finance, and the empire's elite enjoyed unprecedented wealth and privilege. The United Kingdom had firmly established itself as an unrivaled global power, wielding both territorial might and enormous economic, military, and political influence. However, the tides of history are ever shifting, and in the aftermath of the devastating Second World War, a wave of decolonization, fueled by rising nationalist movements, international criticism, and evolving moral values, began to reshape the geopolitical landscape. Britain's once unchallengeable imperial dominance began to unravel, as the world's gaze shifted from indefensible imperialism to the principles of democracy and self-determination. In this era of transformation, 1947 marked a pivotal moment as India declared its independence, sending lasting ripples of change throughout the British Empire. Many territories in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean followed suit, gaining their hard-fought independence in the 1950s and 1960s. The final curtain call for the British Empire arrived formally in 1997 with the poignant handover of Hong Kong to China. The empire, once an unassailable global powerhouse, was no more, leaving behind a legacy of complex narratives, questionable morality, and profound geopolitical challenges. And this is really when things began to go wrong. As the empire gradually diminished, Britain found itself in need of redefinition and reconciliation following the divisive and tumultuous Thatcher era. It was during this period that a revamped Labour Party regained power in May 1997, led by Tony Blair, championing the hopeful slogan of New Labour, New Britain. Blair's tenure ushered in vital constitutional reforms and a substantial surge in public expenditure on healthcare and education. Inflation, which had loomed at nearly 9% in 1991, was tamed, consistently dropping to below 3% throughout Blair's leadership. Over his decade in office, the nation enjoyed stable economic growth, making the longest uninterrupted period of growth in 200 years. But then came the Iraq War in 2003, characterized by allegations of misinformation about weapons of mass destruction and a lack of a clear exit strategy. It eroded public trust and fueled dissatisfaction among Labour Party members, prompting calls for Blair's resignation. This significant episode not only marred Blair's legacy, but also played a pivotal role in shaping the subsequent trajectory of the Labour Party and British politics. In no small part thanks to this, by 2010, David Cameron orchestrated the Conservatives' return to power, forming a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Cameron's tenure commenced with the daunting task of addressing the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, which had plunged the UK economy into its most significant financial turmoil in 7 decades. The government was grappling with a substantial deficit, and the public was hit by the storm of a recession. To navigate these treacherous waters, Cameron implemented austerity measures, extended sectoral support, and initiated welfare reforms. All well and good. In fact, these measures eventually led to a revival and growth of the UK economy, but also marked the beginning of what would become a nightmare. As social issues mounted, the Tories went to war with each other over immigration, the economy, and of course the EU. All the while, the UK grappled with the Scottish independence vote, the Brexit vote, and a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, who promised to clear the whole mess up. Though that didn't go as planned, and she resigned after 4 years of failing Brexit negotiations and almost no progress on social issues such as housing, the National Health Service, and crumbling infrastructure. Things continued to only get worse as Boris Johnson became the next Prime Minister. Amid the Brexit frenzy, social and welfare issues were all but abandoned. Cries of no confidence prompted 2 general elections. And aided by empty promises, the disillusioned dreams of the old empire, and a Labour Party in turmoil under the hapless, hard-left leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, the Tories managed to hold on to power. However, COVID mismanagement and scandals led to even further distrust and dismay at the political chaos which eventually brought down the Johnson government. And then things got worse still. Enter Liz Truss. She became Prime Minister despite more or less no one having even heard of her, and ultimately had less days as leader than the shelf life of a lettuce, just 44 days. However, before leaving office, she managed to send the pound crashing to a record low. Her push for an aggressive tax-cutting policy, at a time when inflation was surging and markets were on edge, could not have come at a worse time, and so, you guessed it, this set the stage for another Prime Minister. Which brings us to the current catastrophe, leader Rishi Sunak. Instead of doing the honourable thing and calling for a general election, Sunak is trying and failing to regain control of a political institution in turmoil, where members of the same leading party are voting against each other in troves. The UK has now come to define itself by terrible catchphrases like "Get Brexit done," though it still isn't done, and "Stop the votes," while trying to convince other countries the UK is progressive and welcoming for all. Ultimately, the UK is now clutching onto an outdated nostalgia for the good old days of empirical autonomy, whilst completely missing the irony that Britain was built on trade and partnerships with other countries. And yet, the UK's growing hostile and nationalistic stance is discouraging international partnerships, while the idea of self-sufficiency remains a fantasy. Britain isn't a major exporter due to limited resources and production industries. Its economy is rooted in trade, yet it has severed ties with its largest trade partner, the EU, leading to dwindling international interest. Consequently, more nations are distancing themselves from the UK. Case in point, during the recent G20 summit, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi cancelled his meeting with Rishi Sunak at the last minute, opting instead for an ad hoc meeting with US President Joe Biden at his home. While Sunak and Modi did eventually meet, it was in a rather unceremonious conference room setting, underscoring a symbolic indifference towards the UK's presence at the summit. The United Kingdom now finds itself receiving a lukewarm reception on the global stage, with earlier discussions and promises about trade agreements, such as the one with the USA following the Brexit referendum, failing to materialize. The reality is, Britain is no longer in high demand on the global stage and is seen as a country that has lost its way. It is at odds with the European Union, is pushing an unsympathetic and inhumane campaign against asylum seekers, has neglected the NHS, repeatedly rolled back on its climate promises, abandoned what is required to make sure its own people are warm and fed during the cost of living crisis, and, at one bizarre point, protested against pork markets and imported cheese. While the United Kingdom still wields significant soft power through culture, educational institutions, science and technology, and remains a vital financial hub, its long-standing values have been completely undermined by chaos and instability. Is this, then, the moment when the sun finally sets on Britain's era of influence? Or will the UK, like a phoenix, rise anew? What do you think? This is Living History, signing out.